The New Revolution Institute presents your call to active citizenship, reclaiming true liberty in the USA. Now this lesson covers the purpose and role of government. Part 1. We're going to discuss 1. The Declaration of Independence and see how it is a reflection of the American mind. 2. The religious views of the founders. 3. The rule of law. And 4. Civil magistrates as ministers of justice. And here's your teacher, Matt Staver.
What is the purpose and role of government? Well, that is clearly set forth in the birth certificate of the United States of America, known as the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who was the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, said that it was a reflection of the American mind. What does he mean by that? He means that the Declaration reflected the ideas of Americans, and in fact, the Declaration of Independence that he drafted was not unique. He was the drafter, but he wasn't really the creator of the ideas. These were common ideas, and that's why he called the Declaration a reflection of the American mind. But many people haven't looked to the Declaration to find out the purpose and role of government, but it's clearly stated. Let's walk through the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, whenever a time in history comes where a group of people that are in a particular government have to separate from that government and create a new government, a government that's consistent with the laws of nature and of nature's God, then it's incumbent upon them when they make that break with the government that they declare the purposes which impel them to that point in history. And that's what is the Declaration of Independence is all about. It sets forth the groundwork, and it then sets forth the specific issues that cause them to the separation. But let's go to the very heart of the Declaration of Independence, because this is really the purpose and the role of government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The Declaration of Independence goes on to say, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. And then he goes on to say, that's exactly what happened to them at that point in history. And the rest of the Declaration of Independence is a point-by-point indictment as to the causes that impelled them to that separation. The very purpose and foundation of government is in that paragraph. We hold these truths, the Declaration says, to be self-evident. They are self-evident because they don't need to be taught. They're just as self-evident as the sun and the moon, daylight and nighttime. They are intuitive that these self-evident ideas and notions are that all of us are created equal. Why? Because we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's very important because the Declaration of Independence shows that our presupposition of government is based upon the existence of God, who is a creator and created each one of us in His image. And just like a painter infuses his or her ideas into the painting, God infused in each one of us certain unalienable rights, rights that the government cannot grant and the government cannot take away.
Definitely, our right comes from God, not from any government, not from the Supreme Court, not from any president. They are rights that nobody can take away from us.
Among these rights, it says, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that governments are to do what? Secure these rights. The government's role, in other words, is to protect these God-given, pre-existing rights that predate government. It goes on to say, whenever any form of government, whether it's the government in America or at that time in Great Britain, begins to develop a pattern, not just a misstep here and there, but a pattern of abuses that no longer protects those God-given unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then it's not only our right, indeed it's our duty to throw off that government and to provide a new government that will do exactly as government is designed to do, protect these God-given pre-existing liberties. The Declaration of Independence could not be more clear as to what the purpose and the role of government is. That was the reflection of the American mind. That was the mindset that ultimately led the founders and those that followed them to sign the Declaration of Independence, our birth certificate, in many cases, their death certificate. They knew that they were pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to do exactly what was necessary at that time, to throw off a government that was tyrannous, that was no longer protecting these God-given religious liberties and inalienable rights. And if you compare the United States of America and the American Revolution with the revolution that was happening at the same time in France, you see two different contrasting views of the role of government. In France during the French Revolution, what we see is the idea that there is no God, that man is the measure of all things, and therefore, since there is no God, there's no absolutes, and without absolutes, who makes the rules? It's the individuals who make the rules. So in the French Revolution, the rights didn't come from God. They were not pre-existing. They were not unalienable rights. They come from government. Government can give you the rights, and government can take away the rights. And if you object, well, what happened in France was they killed you. And the symbol of the French Revolution is the guillotine. The symbol of the American Revolution, obviously, we look at the Statue of Liberty, welcoming people from all shores to come here and have the freedom that we enjoy in America. So the two different roles of governments are clearly reflected at two simultaneous times in history, between the French Revolution, saying that there was no God and therefore rights came from the people, not God, and the American Revolution said that there is a God who's a creator who infused us with unalienable rights that government cannot give and government cannot take away, but government, as its duty and purpose, is to protect those pre-existing God-given rights. That is the role and purpose of government. So whenever you elect any individual or whenever someone is serving in any level of office, what is their duty? Well, their duty is to be consistent with the purpose and role of government. Government is designed to protect these God-given pre-existing liberties. They need to understand, obviously, that there is a God who is a creator who infused us with these liberties. Our rights do not come from the legislative body, and they certainly do not come from the United States Supreme Court. These magistrates, whether they're judges or legislators or local representatives, they serve under a higher authority, and their duty is to act in accordance with those pre-existing principles that come from our Creator. That is their purpose, and that is their role. The Declaration of Independence clearly sets forth the purpose and the role of government. But the Declaration of Independence was drafted by the founders, along with other documents such as the United States Constitution. There's been a lot of debate as to the religious views of the founders. We're not going to go into every single founding father in terms of the religious views, but what religious views were they operating under? If you go back before the founders even became founders, if you will, and look at the very beginning of America, you find that the Mayflower Compact is one of the early documents that ultimately was signed and became a model for future governments, where they were built upon the idea of church covenants and covenants within the Old Testament, how the people entered into a covenant with their community. And the Mayflower Compact clearly indicates that those early settlers came here to advance Christianity in this new world. If you look back at what was happening not only in the United States of America, but throughout Europe, we find that there was a great awakening that was taking place. This great awakening spread across the ocean and impacted the United States of America and certainly impacted others around the world as well. This was an awakening of unprecedented magnitude where preachers spoke many, many times around the country to influence what was taking place in their local communities. Those preachers had a credible impact upon the founding of America. In fact, it is the sermons of pastors that was the fuel for the American Revolution. Without our founding pastors, there would be no founding fathers. In fact, oftentimes if you wanted to find one of the founding fathers, you would go to the local pastor's house because that's where they would be, talking about not only religious but also the political issues of the day. Back then, the pastors did not separate, as some pastors do today, religion and church activity from the civil state. For them, it was all the same. Their Christian worldview impacted their views of how the government should operate. The Founding Fathers clearly understood that Christianity and Judeo-Christianity were essential for this republic. They created a republic that ultimately became the largest republic in world history and the longest lasting republic in world history. We see republics in the Roman era, but they failed. In fact, it was so unique that Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in the mid-1800s, and his purpose was to find out what makes America tick. Why is it that America has been surviving as a republic for so long and larger than any other republic in world history? Republics typically devolved into chaos and anarchy, but America was different. He found that sort of a fourth branch of government existed. Not really a branch of government, but something that influenced all of politics and all of life, and that was Christianity. The pulpits rang with fire, he said, and in fact, it was the Christian worldview that influenced America. Not everyone was Christian, he noted, but they were all influenced by a Judeo-Christian or Christian worldview. The Founding Fathers were clearly influenced by a Christian worldview. Oftentimes, only two Founding Fathers will be focused upon, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and they will be called deist, as though the rest of the Founding Fathers were deist. But a deist in a true sense believes that God created the world, like winding up a clock, walks away and has no more interaction with that world. But Benjamin Franklin, if you remember him, during the famous speech when he got up during the Constitutional Conventions, when it was about ready to fall apart, he stood up and he read that famous statement about how God governs in the affairs of men. A true deist wouldn't believe that God governs in the affairs of men. Now, while Benjamin Franklin may not have been orthodox in his views on Christianity, no question about that, he wasn't someone who believed that God no longer had interaction with the world. In fact, he clearly did. And Thomas Jefferson has many statements about God. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself considered himself to be a Christian. That's what he said. Now, he may not have been as orthodox as you would think an Orthodox Christian would be in terms of believing in the divinity of Jesus Christ or the resurrection from the dead, but he considered himself to be a Christian. At any rate, going beyond Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, we see many other founding fathers. In fact, at George Washington's farewell address, George Washington said that there were two twin pillars that undergird America. Those twin pillars were religion and morality. Why? Because a republic that puts power into the people, power and rights that come from God himself, can only operate with the excessive liberty that provides if the people are self-restrained. In order to have a republic, you have to restrain the people themselves. People are going to be restrained one way or another. Either they're going to be restrained externally by a king or a dictator or a despot, which had been the typical way that governments operated up until the American Revolution. Or they're going to be restrained internally. That's what a republic does, puts power in the people, the power that comes from God, and then the people loan limited power to the government structure to protect those God-given liberties. So the only way a republic can operate with the excessive liberty that it provides is if the people themselves act in self-restraint, if they respect another person's property, not because a dictator has a bayonet over their neck, but that they respect that person's property, they respect that person's life, and they respect that person's liberty. Well, how are you going to have a people that is self-restrained in a republic like the United States of America? There's only one way: the inculcation of religion. The religion that the founders were talking about is Christianity. They clearly operated from a Judeo-Christian worldview. That's why George Washington said the twin pillars of America are religion and morality. The people have to be moral people, respecting the rights and liberties of one another. How are they going to be moral people? By the inculcation and teaching of the Scriptures. And in fact, the first vice president, the second president of the United States, John Adams, said that our Constitution is made only for a religious and a moral people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. We can't just simply take our Constitution, print it off on a word processor, and send it to another country and assume that it'll work for them because it's worked for us. If you don't have the underlying Judeo-Christian worldview, the self-restraint that Christianity provides, then the constitutional form of government that we have will not provide liberty. It will devolve into chaos, just exactly in the way that the republics of ancient Rome ultimately devolved into. What makes America tick is this Christian worldview, or as we often refer to it, a Judeo-Christian worldview. We're going to be talking about that in subsequent lessons. But the views of the Founding Fathers with regards to religion are critical. Here's some of those views from our founders. Sir William Blackstone was an 18th century British law professor, judge, and member of Parliament. He is best known for his 4-volume work, Commentaries on the Laws of England, published from 1765 to 1769, which served as the de facto textbook for law students in England and America for more than a century. In Commentaries, Blackstone lays the Judeo-Christian basis for Western law, asserting that man was created by God and establishing the common law as based upon divine transcendental truth expressed in the law of nature and the law of revelation. Blackstone was often cited by the founders both prior to American independence and during the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. Adherence to Blackstonian principles became the hallmark of early American jurisprudence, influencing leaders from Chief Justice John Marshall to President Abraham Lincoln. In deciding the landmark 1803 case, Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review, Marshall relied on Blackstone's definition of a writ of mandamus. Lincoln, who first read Blackstone's commentaries as an aspiring lawyer, told young law students to likewise begin with Blackstone. Blackstone establishes God as the foundation of the rule of law. In his commentaries, he speaks of the Creator as the source of law. Here are several quotes that served as the foundation on which the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were written. Man, considered as a creature, must necessarily be subject to the laws of his Creator, for he is entirely a dependent being. As man depends upon his Maker for everything, it is necessary that he should, in all points, conform to his Maker's will. This will of his Maker is called the law of nature. For as God, when he created matter and endued it with a principle of mobility, established certain rules for the perpetual direction of that motion. So when he created man and endued him with the free will to conduct himself in all parts of life, he laid down certain immutable laws of human nature, whereby that free will is in some degree regulated and restrained, and gave him also the faculty of reason to discover the purport of those laws. These are the eternal, immutable laws of good and evil, to which the Creator himself in all his dispensation conforms. and which he has enabled human reason to discover, so far as they are necessary for human actions. Such, among others, are these principles: that we should live honestly, should hurt nobody, and should render to everyone his due. Human law must not contravene nature. This law of nature, being co-equal with mankind and dictated by God himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding all over the globe, in all countries, and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority, mediately or immediately, from this original. Blackstone wrote that to discover what the law of nature directs in every circumstance of life, we must apply human reason. However, he says, because of the sinful nature of man, reason can become clouded by passions, prejudice, disease, and intemperance, making this task difficult. Blackstone says that in every man reason is corrupt and his understanding full of ignorance and error. In response, Blackstone writes, divine providence delivered to man through the Holy Scriptures the moral precepts of revealed law. Thus, says Blackstone, upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these. In general, all mankind will agree that government should be reposed in such persons and in whom those qualities are most likely to be found, the perfection of which is among the attributes of him who is emphatically styled the Supreme Being. The three grand requisites, I mean of wisdom, of goodness, and of power: wisdom to discern the real interest of the community, goodness to endeavor always to pursue that real interest, and strength or power to carry this knowledge and intention into action. These are the natural foundations of sovereignty, and these are the requisites that ought to be found in every well-constituted frame of government. Lyman Beecher was a Presbyterian preacher in the early 19th century and a prominent leader in the Second Great Awakening. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin and leading abolitionist, and Henry Ward Beecher were two of his 13 children. In 1806, following the tragic death of Alexander Hamilton, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, who was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, the sitting U.S. Vice President, Beecher preached a famous sermon on a great moral issue of his day. It was titled, "The Remedy for Dueling." In this message can be found many principles that can be applied to the moral issues of our day, such as abortion and same-sex marriage. Lyman presents the sacred vote of Christian citizens as the source for good government. Here are several quotes from this sermon. Dispense with the moral principle and private virtue, and all is gone. You can find no substitute. Honor is a cobweb and patriotism an empty name in the hour of trial. It is in trying emergencies, when the price of perfidy is high and temptation imperious, that unprincipled men are weighed in the balance and found wanting. We may reason and ridicule and lament and remonstrate and threaten and legislate and multiply penalties, and the evil will still progress. Environed by the subtleties of law and shielded by the perverted patronage of men in office, regardless of your grief and fearless of your indignation, they will laugh at your zeal and defy your efforts. There is no way to deal with these men but to make them feel their dependence on the people, and no way to effect this but to take the punishment of their crimes into our own hands. Our conscience must be the judge, and we must ourselves convict and fine and disgrace them at the polls. Here and nowhere beside, our voice be heard and our will become law. Will you any longer, either deliberately or thoughtlessly, vote for them? Will you renounce allegiance to your Maker and cast the Bible behind your back? Will you confide in men void of the fear of God and destitute of moral principle? The man must be bad indeed who can look upon the events of the American Revolution without feeling the warmest gratitude towards the great author of the universe, whose divine interposition was so frequently manifested in our behalf. George Washington. The Bible contains the most profound philosophy, the most perfect morality, and the most refined policy that ever was conceived upon earth. It is the most Republican book in the world, and therefore I will still revere it. John Adams. The Bible is the best of all books, for it is the Word of God and teaches us the way to be happy in this world and in the next. Continue therefore to read it and to regulate your life by its precepts. John Jay, First Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams. The only foundation for useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object and life of all republican governments. Benjamin Rush. The moral or natural law was given by the sovereign of the universe to all mankind. With them it was co-equal, and with them will be coexistent, being founded by infinite wisdom and goodness on essential right, which never varies. It can require no amendment or alteration. Chief Justice John Jay. We are not in a world ungoverned by the laws and power of a superior agent. Our efforts are in His hands and will be directed by it, and He will give them their effect in His own time. Thomas Jefferson. Without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. They, therefore, who are decrying the Christian religion, whose morality is so sublime and pure, which denounces against the wicked the eternal misery and the ensures to the good eternal happiness, are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of free governments. Charles Carroll. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. George Washington. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall be forever encouraged. Northwest Ordinance, Article 3, July 13, 1787. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without His notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without His aid? Benjamin Franklin. Many people talk about the rule of law. They think that the rule of law is anything that a judge or a legislative body says it is. But the rule of law has something more significant in American and Western civilization history. The rule of law has a rich tradition where the government and the leaders are under the law. If you go back to the Magna Carta, the king there originally thought that he was above the law, and kings historically, because of their nature, they were the law, and they could change the rules from day to day because they were the ultimate decision maker. They were the ultimate repository of law. But the Magna Carta was signed that says that even the king himself is under the law. By the time we come to American history and the American Revolution and the founding of America, the idea clearly was that God is the ultimate arbiter of law, that there are certain natural laws that are part of God's natural created order. The Declaration of Independence lists some of those laws of nature and of nature's God to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These laws transcend government, they predate government, and government must conform to those laws. In fact, Blackstone said that if there's a law that is contrary to God's law, it is no law at all. That was not new, because that was the idea coming from Christianity and the Western civilization for many years. Martin Luther King Jr., in the letter from the Birmingham jail, was asked why he obeyed some laws and other laws he did not obey. He said, that's simple. Some laws are just and you have to obey them. You may not like them, but you must obey them. But there's other laws that are unjust, and you have a duty to disobey those laws. Those are laws that are clearly contrary to God's natural law or God's natural created order. They are completely contrary as a man-made law, and as Blackstone and many others would say throughout history, a law that is in conflict with God's natural created order, the natural law, is no law at all. The rule of law says that there is a higher law, a higher principle that predates government. And in fact, that all government must be subjected to the rule of law. It's not simply what a judge says or a legislator says one day and changes to the next day. The rule of law is something even more profound. We must continue to recapture the idea that this is a nation of laws and that we operate under a rule of law that comes from a higher authority. And we must respect and obey those laws They are there to punish the evildoer and to protect the good, as the chapter in Romans 13 clearly says. The rule of law is clearly critical through American history, and we've seen most recently how government officials seem to simply disobey the rule of law. When you do that, it devolves into chaos. We need to recapture the idea of the rule of law. The idea of civil magistrates as being ministers of justice may be new to you, but it is an old concept that has gone through Western civilization and shaped who we are as Americans and has influenced the entire Western thought. A civil magistrate is anyone who is performing work on behalf of the government, whether they're in the federal, state, or local government. That is a civil magistrate, and it includes a judge. Civil magistrates have been, through the Western civilization, considered as ministers of justice, which puts a different spin and idea on their role. When we're talking about ministers of justice, we're talking about someone who is operating under the rule of law. And their obligation is to administer justice to the people, consistent with not only the higher law, but the man-made law that must be made in conformity to that higher law. Ministers of justice, if they don't operate and act as ministers of justice, they have violated their role, and they've stepped outside of their performance as a minister of justice. All magistrates of any level need to understand and operate as though they are a minister of justice. I think when our elected officials understand that idea, and when you, the voter, understand that we are electing ministers of justice, it puts an entirely different concept in view as to their role as they protect your rights, and we understand what the role and purpose of government really is.